Good morning, class. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to be there with you today. So instead, we're going to go ahead and get a jump start on our homework for the week. So at this time, I'm going to need you to pull out your books and open them to chapter 19. We're going to start on page 230 in the section titled Start Here. We're going to stop at the narration breaks where Miss Vicky is going to have questions that you guys can discuss, and then we'll proceed on to the second half of the chapter. Once we're done, we will you'll have a chance to work on your worksheet and complete your timeline. If we're able to get this all done during class time, that means at home this week, you will only have to do the videos and just practice your oral report, which we will do the following week. So that gives you an extra week to practice or add anything or just have it ready for the following week. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're on page 230 in the section titled Start Here. Start Here. In this chapter, we're going to learn about the aftermath of the Great War. The guns may have been silenced, but the world was still in turmoil. It was as though a giant eraser had rubbed out the borders of entire nations, rearranging and shuffling the populations into strange and sometimes unfriendly cultures. It was a time to redraw the map, but who should be trusted to do it? The soldiers needed to go home, but how could they deal with the aftershocks of the trauma they had endured? All over Europe and the Middle East, there were hard feelings and distrust. How could compromises be reached and treaties agreed upon? Should there be punishment doled out on those who started the war? What kind of government would the nations have? There were many questions that didn't seem to have answers. Meanwhile, Russia was having trouble from the inside and the outside. What was going to become of the Tsar and his family? These were tumultuous times indeed. Treaties of World War I and the aftermath. The last gun had boomed. All was quiet on the battlefront that had been the site of the constant fighting and conflict for the last 4 years. Soldiers began to prepare for the return home, thankful to be alive, but also apprehensive over how they would return to civilian life. War is a highly damaging experience. Soldiers who have spent time fighting and doing what needs to be done to win a war have sacrificed much and should be treated with the highest respect and honor. As is true with all wars, many of the soldiers from the Great War dealt with lifelong post-trauma. During this era of history, poetry was highly esteemed and thought to be one of the best ways to express one's thoughts and feelings. In the aftermath of the Great War, many soldiers turned to writing poetry to help them express their feelings and share their experiences. There are many poems written by the soldiers of the Great War that are still available today. Some of these poems were written by soldiers who were killed in action, their words becoming a voice from beyond the grave. The words penned by these brave men are chilling and graphic reminders of the realities of fighting and living in the trenches. The war had ended in November 1918, and 2 months later, in January 1919, the Allied leaders met in Paris to deal with the aftermath. There would need to be some major compromises to come to an agreement that would keep the peace. Diplomats from 32 nations were at the meeting in Paris, where the talks were led by the prime ministers of France and Britain, David Lloyd George and George Clements, and the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who were given the nickname the Big Three. These three disagreed on how to deal with Germany for starting the whole war in the first place. The French and British ministers wanted to punish the Germans, while President Wilson simply wanted to make sure that measures were taken to keep it from happening again. The uneasy agreement they reached is called the Treaty of Versailles. In a situation like this, it is nearly impossible for everyone involved to agree on everything. But the group that met in Paris did accomplish a few major decisions. President Wilson's plan for creating a League of Nations was one of the first things that was agreed upon at the meeting. This league would be an international organization that would be a place where international issues could be discussed and hopefully resolved peacefully and without conflict. Although the League of Nations was truly a good concept, in reality, it had limited success simply because the members had a hard time agreeing about anything. The issues of Germany's punishment was another issue discussed, argued about, and compromised on. Everyone agreed that Germany's power needed to be limited so they couldn't start another war. In the end, Germany lost their overseas colonies, some of their European territories, and a large portion of their armed forces. On top of losing much of their military power and colonies, Germany was also blamed by starting the war in the war guilt clause of the treaty. In compensation for the damage and expenses of the war, the Allies ordered Germany to pay billions of dollars in money and goods. This money was called reparations payments, and it was such a huge amount that it was estimated it would take the Germans until 1984 to pay it. In fact, it was finally paid off in 2010. German representatives had not been invited to the peace meetings, but they were told to come and sign the finished treaty. Of course, they were not happy about it. And when the German people found out about the guilt clause and the reparations they would have to pay, there were protests in the streets. However, they did not have a choice, and on June 28, 1919, Germany finally signed the agreement. The Treaty of Versailles was only the beginning of dealings with the world after the Great War. Political boundaries had been erased as Germany lost many of its European holdings. Austria-Hungary was now divided, and the Turkish Ottoman Empire was broken up as well. New countries were established, and old ones came back into existence. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were two new countries, and Poland, which had not had independence since 1795, was reestablished on the map. Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia all had once been part of Russia, but had been lost to Germany in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in March of 1918. Now they were recognized as independent states, with their borders officially represented on the map. All of the defeated nations of Europe, including Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, were weakened and reduced to a much smaller size. They also lost many of their natural resources and land. Most of these remapping decisions were made by the representatives of the U.S., Italy, Britain, and France, without much consideration or consultation of the smaller countries involved. This exclusion created a resentment in Eastern Europe as people found themselves being lumped in with people from other ethnic groups and languages. This unhappy resentment and tension sometimes turned into violence. With the redrawing of the map, what used to be the Turkish Ottoman Empire was divided up too. Allied troops occupied the northern part, which according to the treaty was supposed to be the independent nation of Turkey. It was not until 1923 that the Turkish nationalists finally drove out the troops and declared themselves to be the independent Republic of Turkey. It was also during this time of reconfiguring and reorganizing that half of Palestine was set aside for the Jews of the world as a future homeland. The declaration was called the Balfour Declaration. The declaration was actually a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to a prominent British Jewish citizen, Baron Lionel Walter Rothschild, expressing Balfour's support for a homeland in Palestine for the Jews of the world. Because Britain was one of the big threes at the Versailles Treaty in 1919, they had the influence to make this idea a reality. To this day, there is fighting over this area. We will study this more in depth in a later chapter. But for now, just remember that this is the area that was the promised land. God gave his people, the Israelites. If you were with me in the first volume of this series, you may remember learning about the historical events that took place in AD 70 during the time of the Roman Empire, when the Jews were forced to leave Israel and were dispersed around the world. So we're going to stop here, and Miss Vicki is going to go over some questions with you, and then we will resume our lesson.